Hi, everybody. This is Meyer GutbrodNARWC2020. I am an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina, and the work I'm going to share with you is co-authored by Kim Davies and Chuck Green. We're going to talk about the oceanographic processes that have impacted the Gulf of Maine foraging ecology for right whales and that triggered the abrupt right whale distribution shift. In 2015, Andy Pershing published this great study showing that the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than, in fact, we've been expecting. And actually, the sea surface temperatures are warming faster than 99% of the global ocean. Then Vince Saba, the next year, published a study showing that Gulf of Maine may actually be warming more from below. And so he did some climate model projections and found that when you include a higher resolution bathymetry, you get a better, a more accurate projection on how the Gulf of Maine will change as CO2 levels continue to rise. So this schematic shows sort of the trajectory of the Gulf Stream. And as it moves farther north, that hot, salty water will mix into the slopewater sea here and has an opportunity then to mix into the Gulf of Maine. We found funding to process continuous plankton recorder samples that have been sitting on a shelf for a while. So we processed samples to look at late-stage Calanus finmarchicus abundance from 2013 to 2017. The CPR stopped running in 2017, so that's as far as we could go. One note that I'm going to make here is that in 2014, the CPR changed its transect. So the CPR has been run very consistently for more than 50 years on this path from Boston to Cape Sable. And then in 2014, mostly logistical issues with finding the ship to tow the CPR route was changed to go from Portland, Maine to Cape Sable, Nova Scotia. So we have more confidence in the long-term data set and its ability to characterize the eastern Gulf of Maine and the Scotian Shelf than we do here in the western Gulf of Maine and sort of Massachusetts Bay Area. So using the Gulf Stream Index, which was originally developed by Joyce in 2000, the Gulf Stream Index is an attempt to map the position of the north wall of the Gulf Stream. And when the index is positive, that means that that north wall of the Gulf Stream is farther north than the typical mean path. And when the index is negative, then the Gulf Stream is farther south. And this is, these are based off of an empirical orthogonal function analysis taken using temperatures at 200-meter depth and along the 15°C isotherm. And here we can see that since 2010, we've had this big anomalous increase in the Gulf Stream Index. So we've shifted into this regime where the Gulf Stream is farther north than it has been. And we wanted to figure out how that's really affecting the waters in the Gulf of Maine and the Scotian Shelf. So we looked at this index, the Regional Slope Water Temperature Index, which is a PCA, Principal Components Analysis, from these different polygons, these ones that are outlined in red, that was developed at the Bedford Institute of Oceanography. And so when this Regional Slope Water Temperature Index is positive, then those deep slope waters at 150 and 200 meters are warmer than they have been typically over the past. And when the index is negative, of course, the waters are colder. So in 2010, when we saw that shift in the Gulf Stream moving back into that northerly position, we also started to see a really high, so hot, Regional Slope Water Temperature Index. Then looking at that Calanus finmarchicus data that we analyzed, we decided to look specifically at the eastern portion of the data set, so the East Gulf of Maine box, again, because that part of the transect maps on pretty well to the historical transect, and so the time series is reasonably consistent. And we looked at the third quarter, so that means the months of July, August, and September, because that's when the right whales have really been changing their distribution sort of in the most obvious way. We're used to them being in the Bay of Fundy and eating along the Scotian Shelf here, and instead they've been moving them into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So here's the late stage Calanus index, and we've seen that since 2010 there's been another decline in Calanus, so a decline in prey availability. And I put this dashed line here. A model that I built a while ago showed that right whales, even females that were able to get pregnant, when Calanus falls below this threshold for this region in the late summer, right whales have a really hard time sustaining the pregnancy, and they tend to be more vulnerable to a neonatal and prenatal mortality. And that contributed to the decline in calving we saw in the 1990s. And it seems that the Calanus has dropped below that threshold and potentially could have contributed to the decline in calving that we've seen in the past decade. When you stack these time series on top of each other, here we've got the Gulf Stream Index, the Regional Slope Water Temperature Index, the Calanus, late stage Calanus in the eastern Gulf of Maine for the third quarter, and then right whale calving. So this is actually the number of calves born divided by the number of females that are available to reproduce. We see this really marked regime shift in 2010 that goes sort of from the physical to the ecological parts of the story. The Gulf Stream starts to shift north, that water gets hotter, Calanus declines, and the birth rates drop. So we wanted to look at that in more detail. So I used the sightings per unit effort data that's compiled by the Right Whale Consortium, and I built some Poisson models to determine whether or not the right whale spewey sightings per unit effort has changed significantly this decade relative to the previous decade. And I built a shapefile with some of these right whale habitat areas that were designated in the right whale photo ID database. And so I built a Poisson model for each area and for each month, asking the question, has distribution changed this decade relative to the last decade? And this heat map shows models that have a significant change between those two decades. And the y-axis is the different right whale habitats in this Gulf of Maine Scotian Shelf area. And the x-axis is months, so from January to December. And the first thing I want you to see is that, and let me say that red boxes indicate areas where the sightings are higher now than they have been a decade ago. And blue boxes indicate areas where the sightings are lower now relative to the previous decade. And so we just see a lot of blue here in the second half of the year. So right whales, this is just another indication that right whales really are abandoning the Gulf of Maine Scotian Shelf area because they're transitioning into those habitats farther north. And there's a lot to unpack here, and just in a couple of minutes we can zoom in and see, for example, in the month of March, there is an increase in habitat use in southern New England now relative to the previous decade, whereas the habitat use in the Great South Channel was higher last decade than it is now. And in July, just as another example, again, the Great South Channel usage was higher a decade ago than it is now. And in the Bay of Fundy, the habitat usage was higher last decade than it is now. So we can see kind of in a higher resolution how habitat use has changed between what used to be their more frequent distribution and this new regime. So the next thing I'm hoping to do is amass together a lot of Calanus, Finmarchicus, and potentially Hyperboreus data to sort of get a sense of the cumulative amount of prey that right whales are getting access to over a year, how that impacts their reproduction, and how that accumulation of prey is changing depending on the habitat use strategy that individuals are utilizing, as well as sort of the major climate and environmental regime shifts that we've been seeing. So that work is coming up, and I'm excited to do it. Thanks to all my co-authors, funding agencies, collaborators. It's definitely a teamwork. So thanks everybody, and I'm happy to take questions during the meeting.